Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be looking at Percy Bysshe Shelley's overtly political poem England in 1819, in which he proclaims his indignation at the terrible condition of England as he sees it in 1819 and his hope for future revolution. I'm going to start with some crucial historical context, the so-called Peterloo massacre of August 1819, which happened only a few months before Shelley wrote the poem. And then I'm going to provide a close analysis of the poem itself, of England in 1819, by going through the poem line by line. The catalyst for Shelley writing such a provocative political poem as England in 1819, and incidentally actually the title England in 1819 isn't Shelley's own title, it was given to the poem by his wife Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, when she first published the poem in the Poetical Works of 1839. So not until 20 years after he'd actually written the poem was the poem published. He tried to get it published, sort of. He wrote to a friend who was a publisher and said, I don't expect you to publish it, but do pass it around to anyone you think might be interested. So he knew that it was provocative. Shelley knew that it was provocative and probably knew that it wouldn't see its way into print because it was so provocative. And the immediate catalyst for writing, as I said, such a provocative political poem was the Peterloo massacre, which happened on the 16th of August 1819. In St Peter's Field, on the outskirts of Manchester, which is part of the industrial north of England, between 60,000 and 80,000 people, men, women and children, gathered to peacefully protest in support of various parliamentary reforms, including for reforming or even repealing and abolishing the 1815 Corn Law. Corn here meaning any kind of grain, cereal, wheat, etc. The 1815 Corn Law was designed to keep corn prices high by prohibiting cheap imports. Good for the landowners, not so good for poor people who could not afford to buy bread, especially after the terrible harvests of 1816, which led to extreme poverty and starvation. The crowd had gathered in St Peter's Field to hear the known radical orator Henry Hunt declare the need for liberty and political rights, including universal suffrage, that is, the right to vote. The local magistrates responded by declaring the meeting illegal and sending in the regular cavalry, so the military, and local yeomanry, who were mounted militiamen, to arrest Henry Hunt as he addressed the crowd and so break up the meeting. There was panic, the crowd surged, the militia charged the crowd with sabres drawn, and unprovoked violence erupted. By some estimates, 15 people were killed and over 600 were injured, including children. Lord Liverpool, who was the Prime Minister, and the Prince Regent, so government and royalty, two branches, of course, of the establishment, both publicly defended the conduct of the authorities. The overbearing brutality of the authorities, however, provided opponents of the government with a powerful representation of the current system's cruelty and oppression, tyranny even. The news spread far and wide, including to Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was living in self-imposed exile in Italy at the time. The Peterloo massacre absolutely enraged Shelley, but he hoped that it would at least galvanise the population into rebellion against the oppressive regime, as Shelley saw it. He wrote to his publisher, Charles Ollier, exactly 3 weeks after the Peterloo massacre, on the 6th of September 1819. The same day that your letter came news of the Manchester work, that is, the Peterloo massacre. And the torrent of my indignation has not yet done boiling in my veins. I wait anxiously to hear how the country will express its sense of this bloody, murderous oppression of its destroyers. Something must be done. What? Yet I know not. The quotation is from Percy Bysshe Shelley's play The Cenci, which Shelley had just written in the summer of 1819, which is also about tyranny and the arbitrary exertion of power. The authorities, according to Shelley, both oppress and destroy the country, and Shelley is anxious for reaction from the country, from the people. Shelley's torrent of indignation at the oppression and destruction of the disenfranchised people of England was still boiling in his veins 3 months later when he composed England in 1819. I'm now going to go through the poem, analysing it line by line and unpicking it in a little bit more detail. England in 1819. An old, mad, blind, despised and dying king. Princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring. Rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling, till they drop blind in blood without a blow. A people starved and stabbed in the untilled field. An army whom liberticide and prey makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield. Golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay. Religion, Christless, godless, a book sealed. A senate, time's worst statute unrepealed, are graves, from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. It's a very evocative poem. I hope you think so too. So to go through it then, line by line. An old, mad, blind, despised and dying king. We've got a long list there, and the monosyllables at the beginning, old, mad, blind, with the very hard consonants, D sounds, so old, mad, blind, which really means that you have to emphasise each one of those monosyllables. It means that it's slow and protracted, a bit like the dying king himself, that it's kind of slowing down and laboured. An old, mad, blind, despised. So we've got the D, again, the consonants of the D sound, and dying king, again, the consonants of the D sound. The king himself was George III, King George III, who was born in 1738, so he was quite old by this time and had been on the throne since 1760. So he'd been on the throne for nearly 60 years. He's metaphorically blind to the plight of his people. Old, mad, blind. He had been deteriorating in health for decades, physically and, crucially, mentally. So his first severe bout of mental illness had been in 1788, but he suffered increasingly severe episodes, which is why the regency had to be declared in 1811. The regency meant that the king, King George III, was not kind of officially in power. That was the Prince Regent. So the Prince Regent was seen then as the ruler of the country, kind of officially. And that's why the period between 1811 and 1820 is called the Regency, because the Prince Regent was sort of technically in charge. So the Prince Regent ruled by proxy, and King George III would actually go on to die very, very shortly after the poem was written. So he would die then on the 29th of January 1820. So he really was dying when Shelley wrote the poem. Princes. The princes here are George III's many sons, who were notoriously profligate, dissolute and corrupt. But especially the Prince Regent, the Prince of Wales, who, as I've said, was ruling at this time by proxy and would go on, when his father died in January 1820, to become King George IV. He was known as extravagant, sybaritic and spoiled. His coronation banquet, for example, cost £100,000. At that time, that was an excessive, a grotesque amount of money to spend on a coronation banquet when the rest of the country was starving, as we'll get on to later in the poem. So, princes, the dregs of their dull race. Dull here in its 18th century meaning. So if we look at Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, which was published in 1755, he defines dull as stupid, doltish, blockish, unapprehensive, slow of understanding. So it means not very intellectually capable, is a perhaps polite way of putting it. So princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn. So they're condemned, they're detested, they're hated by the public, and hopefully, the poem seems to be suggesting, soon to be rejected. These princes are mud from a muddy spring. The opposite of what a spring is supposed to be, of course. A spring is supposed to be, it's supposed to produce pure, clear, clean water, which is essential for life. So symbolically, something that's supposed to be essential for life, water, is muddy. It's dirty, putrid, unclean, harmful, dangerous to the health. And that's what these princes are. They're not nurturing the public properly. They're not even providing the country with what it needs. You know, if you're thinking of a spring as a place where you're supposed to have clean water, people need clean water to stay alive, and you know, they're so corrupt that they're just killing the country. Essentially, they're polluting the country. In these two lines, I think, the dregs of their dull race who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring, although initially it might sound despairing, does leave some room for hope, I think, because the dregs implies the last remaining bits. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines dregs as the sediment of liquors, the more solid particles which settle at the bottom of a solution or other liquid. So if you're having a glass of red wine, for example, and you get that red sort of those crusty bits at the bottom, the sediment at the bottom, those are the dregs. So if you are getting to the dregs, then you are getting to the end. And in their place, hopefully, another spring will spring up and flow through the public, this time pure and clear and clean and unpolluted. Then we move on to rulers. Now, who exactly these rulers are is left slightly opaque. Is Shelley continuing to refer to the monarchy, or does rulers include politicians? Either way, these rulers are establishment authority. Rulers who neither see nor feel nor know. They refuse to care about England's problems. They do not see, meaning that they turn their eyes away from, echoing the blindness of the king, the metaphorical blindness, although his eyesight was failing as well, but also the metaphorical blindness of the king in line 1. They do not feel, meaning they reject compassion and emotional sympathy, and they do not know. And I think here that doesn't mean that they do not understand intellectually what the problems are. I think Shelley means rather that they do not have first-hand empirical knowledge or experience of the effects of their rules on the people who are less well off than themselves. They do not know in that sense of that you really truly know something if you have experienced it yourself. You know what poverty is if you have lived in poverty. You know what oppression is if you have kind of felt the hand of, you know, the oppressor on the back of your neck, and so on. I think that's what Shelley means here by know. Rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like. Leeches, of course, suck the blood, but leech-like And again, we've got the tying those two words together with the same consonant sounds. Here the L, so the consonants of the L sound. But leech-like to their fainting country cling, till they drop, blind in blood without a blow. These rulers are kind of cannibalistic vampires, sucking the blood, the life out of the country, and they are gorging themselves to such an extent till they drop blind in blood. And again, we've got the alliteration of the BL sound, bl sound here, so blind, blood, blow. And we've also got the hard D sounds again, which are picking up, I think, the hard D sounds in the opening line that I mentioned earlier. So blind, blood, it's that hard sound. I think there are a lot of quite hard words that are used here. So similarly, mud, the monosyllabic word with the hard D sound at the end. And I think it's to create a poem that sounds very hard, because he's very angry. So he wants to sound forceful, and he wants the kind of aural quality of the poem to echo that sense of forcefulness. So, till they drop blind in blood, that they are killing the country. So that they're sucking the lifeblood out of the country. They are killing the country, to their fainting country cling. That they keep sucking the blood. They're still clinging to it, and they continue to suck it even as the country is fainting. And they survive on the blood of the country, these rulers. But there is hope again too, I think. The country is not yet dead. It is only fainting. It has not yet had the kind of final, fatal blow struck. So without a blow. So I think that might mean that without actually yet killing the country. So the country then can still be revived, can recover, can be restored to health. And that's the hope, I think, in that image. We then move on to the introduction of the people. A people starved and stabbed in the untilled field. And this is the reference, a kind of overt reference to the Peterloo massacre, because the sabres, so the kind of swords, the militiamen had charged at the crowd with their sabres, their swords drawn, and many of the injuries had been the result of being injured with the sabres. As you hopefully saw in the pictures earlier, that's what was reflected in the cartoons and kind of in the imagery of the time, that you had these men on horseback stabbing children and women with swords. Starved and stabbed in the untilled field. There's a kind of twofold meaning here. So we've got the starving people were stabbed, and they were protesting because they were starving. So these starving people were stabbed in St. Peter's Field, obviously the site of the Peterloo massacre, where people had gathered to peacefully protest against the Corn Laws, among other things. Symbolically, there's a kind of grim irony that starving people are gathering in a field, not to till it, to cultivate it, or to use it to grow a harvest that might feed them, but to protest against the Corn Laws. So I think there's that kind of symbolism in the image of the untilled field. We then have the army mentioned, which again is a sort of reference to the Peterloo massacre, whom liberticide, so liberticide is the killing of liberty. So whom liberticide, the killing of liberty, and prey makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield. So the two-edged sword, meaning that it cuts both ways. So it cuts those who wield it as well as those attacked. By preying on others, they become prey themselves. by killing the liberty of others, they kill their own liberty. So that's the kind of slightly odd image of liberticide and prey makes as a two-edged sword. So liberticide is the killing of liberty, and the prey in that is liberty. So you've got the killing of liberty and liberty going hand in hand in that image there. And what's interesting, I think, is that perhaps here Shelley refers to the Bible. So Matthew verse 26, chapter 52 reads, and this is the King James Version, "Then said Jesus unto him, Put up again thy sword into his place." So that means sort of put your sword back into its place. So put away your sword. "For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." Ironically, then, Shelley is aligning his argument with the words of Jesus Christ, while he sees organised religion as Christless, which we'll get onto in line 11. And this is also ironic because Shelley was kicked out of the University of Oxford for producing a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism. And he'd sort of flirted with ideas of atheism, but he's also a very sort of spiritual writer as well. But it's interesting, I think, here that he seems to be drawing on the words of Jesus Christ to align his argument with the words of the actual sort of words of Jesus Christ, and opposing it to the organised religion, as I said, that we'll get onto in line 11. Then we have the golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay. Sanguine here pertaining to the blood. So sanguine laws are kind of bloodthirsty laws. Golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay. So golden and sanguine here suggesting money and violence, two planks obviously of tyranny, or at least two planks that those oppressors, those people, those tyrants use to oppress others. They use money and they use violence. Shelley's point here is that those who make the laws enrich and protect themselves. They are tempted by gold and they slay the general population in bloodthirsty self-protection, self-preservation. And then we get on to the introduction of religion, which I was mentioning just a moment ago. So in line 11, religion, Christless, godless, a book sealed. So what, and sort of the question seems to be being asked here, what is religion without, or at least what is Christian religion, without Jesus Christ or God or the Bible? It is merely an administrative organisation devoid of all the spiritual, worthy, divine elements, you might say. And even perhaps to be godless suggests to be evil. So to be with Satan. So if you are godless, are you with Satan? There might also be an irony in his use of a book sealed. It is Shelley who was drawing on the morals within the Bible to support his argument earlier that I mentioned. So the quotation of Jesus Christ about the sword. And then we have a Senate. So the Senate here is the unreformed Parliament. Unreformed, that is, because this is pre the Reform Act of 1832, which aimed to counter some of the woeful unrepresentativeness of the House of Commons at this time. So Henry Hunt at Peterloo had been advocating universal suffrage. So Shelley's use of Senate is ironic. If a Senate is, in Samuel Johnson's definition from a dictionary of the English language from 1755, if a Senate is an assembly of councillors, a body of men set apart to consult for the public good, then modern Parliament has fallen well short of the classical ideals of public good. Time's worst statute unrepealed. So this refers to the various Test and Corporations Acts that had occurred since the 17th century. since the restoration of the monarchy, beginning in 1661. Central to these worst statutes was the requirement of public pledging of allegiance for all officials to the Church of England, and imposing of various civil disabilities on religious dissenters, nonconformists and Catholics, thus heavily curtailing religious freedom. This remained unrepealed, as the Acts had survived repeated attempts at repeal, modification and reform. And indeed, elements of these Acts would not be repealed until much, much later in the 19th century. And this line also reflects back on the previous line, religion Christless, godless, a book sealed. So because at this time the Church of England was the official religion of, well, it's still the official religion of the country, but because you could not be an official, and there were various other things, you couldn't live within a certain radius of the City of London, for example, all sorts of things that made life very difficult for dissenters, nonconformists and Catholics. Because officially you had to be pledge your allegiance to the Church of England. If you've pledged your allegiance to the Church of England, but it is Christless, godless and Bibleless, a book sealed, then essentially all you are is an administrative organ of the state. And then we get on to the closing couplet, our graves, from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. So there's an interesting grammatical construction choice by Shelley here. And you can see that in the opening, our graves. So the expanding litany of injustices consists of main clauses that remain unsolved until the penultimate, the 13th line. England in 1819 forms a sonnet, so a 14-line poem, and the turn, the volta, comes at the final couplet, which is unusual in a sonnet form, where the volta or the turn usually comes after the octet, so after the opening 8 lines, and before the sestet, the closing 6 lines. But here it's just before the closing couplet. And it is only in the closing couplet that we learn what all these unjust forms of governance, kind of bundled together, actually are. So it's only at the opening of the closing couplet that the king, the princes, the rulers, the army, the laws, the religion, what are they? They are graves. Graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. These unjust institutions of governance are graves from which a glorious revolutionary force, glorious phantom might spring. So may burst, bringing illumination and enlightenment. And note that this is, or Shelley represents it as, our tempestuous day. So Shelley establishes the opposition of them in the kind of previous section of the poem. So their dull race, them, against us here in the closing couplet. They are deteriorating and degenerating towards the grave, and our illumination is going to kind of, or hopefully will rise phoenix-like from the ashes. Although the overall message of the poem is hopeful, I think, I do think we ought to pay attention to the fact that the use of may is significant, and may forms the rhyme of the final couplet, so with day. Our graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. So that's emphasising, it's not emphasising the burst. He doesn't choose to rhyme on burst, he chooses to rhyme on may. So it seems to be suggesting that he wants to emphasise that change only may happen. The ordinary people of the country have to make it happen. So if we go back to the letter that I quoted at the beginning, where Shelley writes to his publisher And he says, "The torrent of my indignation has not yet done boiling my veins. I wait anxiously to hear how the country will express its sense of this bloody, murderous oppression of its destroyers. Something must be done." He's emphasising there that he wants kind of action. Something must be done. He wants the country to express its sense of this bloody, murderous oppression. He wants the country just to stop sort of accepting it, stop allowing the leeches to drain the blood, stop kind of accepting the fating state of the country, but to do something about it. And that's why I think the emphasis on the may is important, because he wants to emphasise that change is not going to happen. It may happen, but if you want it to happen, you have to actually do something about it. And it may well be that, which is the most provocative element of the poem, that he seems to be inciting the people to action. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do please subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do please press the like button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. And do leave your interpretation of the poem below. What do you make of Shelley's England in 1819?